This book, I'm going to read a couple pages from the book to begin with, and then we'll start talking about it. But I mean, I really think that you need to understand a little bit about the kind of personality you're dealing with here. And this guy, William Cooper, is he's no longer with us. He died in a very picturesque way, shooting it out with the police on a lonely hilltop in Arizona at midnight. So he's quite a guy. And one of the things that Bill Cooper, among many other things, one of the things he was famous for is his predictions. He made a lot of predictions, many of which came true. In his book, now this is a very rare and interesting book, Behold a Pale Horse. This is his book. This is the one book that he wrote during his life on Earth. And he predicted, for instance, that the excessive prescription of Adderall and Ritalin and certain drugs like that would inevitably, this is 1991, this book was written. This book was written in 1991, is still number one on numerous Amazon categories, including rare and, I don't know what it's called, rare and obscure knowledge. Still the number one book 27 years after it was published. So in any event, he predicted in this book that because of the excessive prescription of Ritalin and Adderall and Prozac and stuff like that, there would be an enormous an outbreak of school shootings in the United States about 10 years after he wrote the book, and that's exactly what happened. Of course, he also said that this would lead to the crackdown on guns in America, which would be, and the Second Amendment would be violated by this, which was, that's a political issue, but it's indeed, that also came true. In any event, one of his most, I'm going to read a couple pages about probably his most famous prediction, although not my favorite of his predictions. Cooper's most famous prediction was made on June 28, 2001, the broadcast of his radio show, The Hour of the Time. A little past his 58th birthday and drinking heavily, Cooper was doing the program from a studio he'd built in a den of his house at 96 North Clearview Circle, atop the hill in the small White Mountains, Arizona town of Eager, 15 miles from the New Mexico line. Can you believe what you've been seeing on CNN today, ladies and gentlemen? Cooper asked the Hour of a Time audience. Supposedly, a CNN reporter found Osama bin Laden and took a television crew with him and interviewed him and his top leadership, his lieutenants and his colonels and his generals in their hideout. Now, don't you think that's kind of strange, folks? Cooper said with his signature chuckle. Because of the largest intelligence operation in the world, with the biggest budget in the history of the world, has been looking for Osama bin Laden for years and years and years and years, and they can't find him. But some doofus, jerk-off reporter with his little camera crew waltzes right into his secret hideout and interviews him. This meant two things, Cooper told the audience. Either everybody in the intelligence community and all the intelligence agencies of the United States government are blithering idiots and incompetent fools, or they're lying to us. The fact was, Cooper told the audience, no one in the U.S. intelligence services was really looking for Osama bin Laden. They knew where he was. They had since the beginning of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Bin Laden, along with his entire family, was a wholly owned subsidiary of the Central Intelligence Agency. They created him. They're funding him. They supported him, and he has served them well. There were rumors floating around the mass media that bin Laden was planning attacks on the United States and Israel, but this was just more subterfuge, Cooper said. If Osama bin Laden was really an enemy of Israel, don't you think the Mossad would have taken care of him a long time ago, Cooper asked. Something else was in the wind. There was no other reason for the government to allow the CNN report, but to further stamp bin Laden's bearded, pointy face upon the collective American mindset. Boogeyman man of the moment, the Saudi prince, was being readied for his close-up. I'm telling you, they would be prepared for a major attack, Cooper declared. The target would be a large American city. Something terrible is going to happen in this country, and whatever is going to happen that they're going to blame on Osama bin Laden, don't you even believe it. 2.5 months later, on September 11, 2001, after two commercial airliners flew into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in a cataclysm that killed 2,996 people, including 343 New York City Fire Department personnel, Cooper's prediction came to pass. By the time Cooper got on the air that morning, the towers had already fallen. Several hours passed before the name Osama bin Laden surfaced on the BBC feed that Cooper was monitoring. The British station, which Cooper regarded as marginally more reliable than American networks, was doing an interview with the former Israeli Prime Minister, General Ehud Barak, and Richard Pearl, the chairman of George W. Bush's Defense Advisory Commission. Widely known as the Prince of Darkness, in part for his Reagan-era support of Edward Teller's $100 billion strategic defense initiative known as Star Wars, Pearl said the attacks on New York and Washington were clearly an act of war. All our Western civilization is under attack, Barak put in. The interviewer asked Pearl if he thought that the United States would be justified in firing cruise missiles at Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. Pearl, who along with fellow neocons Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, and Donald Rumsfeld would soon push hard for the reinvasion of Iraq. He answered in the affirmative. The Afghani authorities had allowed Osama bin Laden to operate in their territory, Pearl said. Now, this alone was reason enough for a military strike. Bin Laden was involved, no doubt about it. Yes, Barak agreed. There was every reason to believe that bin Laden was behind the attack. It was then that Cooper interrupted the transmission, shouting, "How do they know who did it? If the United States government had no warning, like they say, if they didn't know who was going to mount these attacks, and there are no survivors from the planes in these, how do they know Osama bin Laden is behind it?" So yet again, Bill Cooper was right. Events were transpiring exactly as his research had indicated. Osama bin Laden, the Saudi mama boy prince, was about to be officially blamed for the most spectacular foreign attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor. Not that Cooper was gloating about his latest successful prediction. What had happened in New York, thousands dead, their bodies crushed beneath twisted rubble, a toxic cloud rising above the metropolis, was just the beginning of a new torrent of death. On the radio feed, Pearl and Barak were discussing logistics. Afghanistan would be a target, and Iraq as well. How can they determine that they should bomb Afghanistan? Cooper shouted with alarm. Who are we going to be bombing? The terrorists or the innocent people of Kabul? Cooper made another prediction. Folks, I can assure you that 72 hours from now we're going to be at war. We will be bombing 2 or maybe 3 countries, because that's how it works. When the governments are attacked, they lash out. Hundreds of people, thousands of people who had nothing to do whatsoever with what is happening at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon are going to die. Nothing will be the same after today, Cooper said grimly. Get ready for it, folks, because that's what you're going to be hearing for the next weeks and months and years on television and the radio. Nothing will be the same after today. Because I tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that's what the people who really did this want you to think. That nothing, absolutely nothing will be the same after today. And you know what? They're right. They're telling the truth about that. Within weeks, Congress will pass a draconian legislation aimed at restricting the rights of American citizens. You're going to have surveillance cameras on every street corner. Now that's true, right? You think your phones are being tapped now? Just wait. No one is going to gain from this except a very small group of people. Everybody else will lose. No one will lose more than the American people. This would be the most grievous casualty of the 9/11 attacks, Cooper told the audience. The nation itself, the America that could have been, freedom, that most elusive of qualities, best distilled in the inspired documents of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, have been dealt a fatal blow. From now on, freedom will be whatever the law allows you to do, Cooper said. That wasn't going to stop him, Cooper told the listeners. He'd stay behind his microphone up in his Hilltop studio. He'd keep sending out the hour of the time, speaking truth to the ultimate power, if it was the last thing he did. And soon after that, Cooper's final prediction also came true. They're going to kill me, ladies and gentlemen, he told the audience. They're going to come up here in the middle of the night and shoot me dead, right on my front doorstep. And around midnight on November 5th, 2001, less than 2 months after the 9/11 attacks, that's exactly what happened. So that is the story of Bill Cooper. Now, Bill Cooper is a guy who is generally considered to be a conspiracy nut, and he was, but he had a lot to say, and that's the reason why I spent all this time working on this book, because I thought it was an interesting topic. And my man here, Danny, is going to begin grilling me with a third degree here that only he can do.
Well, I've got this list of questions you gave me.
That doesn't mean you have to ask me those questions. Those happen to be questions that I have an answer for.
But I just want you to allow, first of all, congratulations. This is such a masterpiece. It is so...
That's why I got him to come up here, right?
And complex, and says so much about America uniquely at this time, and it's a tremendous accomplishment. But I don't understand, with all the people you have access to and the different things you could have done, why did you decide to do this? It's a couple of years out of your life. What was the impetus to do it?
Well, I don't know. As a journalist, which is basically what I am, at least that's how I make my living, or have, until I semi-retired after finishing this stupid book. But I began to feel that sometimes you just have to go with something that's telling you that something is actually interesting.
But how did you find out about him in the first place?
Well, the first time I found out about Bill Cooper was, it's a long story, but it's in the book. But Bill Cooper was a guy he's gone through every single fringe discipline in American history. Since post-World War II. He was interested in flying saucers, he was interested in secret societies, but in the beginning, he was just going around, and he was kind of a typical conspiracy guy in the sense that he was trying to figure out what happened to the Kennedy assassination. The Kennedy assassination is it's the crime of the century. It happened before hundreds and hundreds of eyewitnesses. Yet somehow it's never been solved to anybody's satisfaction. And Lee Harvey Oswald, you could walk around this whole city and you couldn't find one person that thinks that Lee Harvey Oswald did it and acted alone. It's just not. Michael Daly. Michael Daly is the only person. That's the exception that proves the rule, my son. In any event, and it just doesn't make any sense because, the cops are solving murders every day. And they, in TV, they're solving these murders on Law and Order. It's all wrapped up in an hour, with commercials. So in any event, Cooper, by the time he emerges on the scene in the late 1980s, you've had already 25, 26 years of Kennedy assassination mishigas about different things, the grassy knoll, this, that. You know them all. And what Bill Cooper said, which I found out about in a kind of weird way, was he came up with this kind of artfully brilliant idea that all these complicated things about Carlo Marcello, the mobster from New Orleans, and Fidel Castro, all this stuff was all crap. It was very obvious who killed Kennedy. It was the driver of the limousine. He just turned around and he shot the guy. And somehow people didn't happen to notice this. So but it was clear It was clear from the Zapruder film. I guess assume everybody knows what the Zapruder film is. The Zapruder film was a film that was shot by a guy named Abraham Zapruder, who was a maker of children's clothing with his Bell & Howell's Zoom-matic, and it's the actual only record of the Kennedy assassination, because it was not on national TV, which most people actually seem to believe was not true. So, like, and like, if you watch, and at that time, the Zapruder film was impossible to see. It was bought by Life magazine, Henry Luce, and Henry Luce's lieutenant, this guy C.D. Jackson. They gave Abraham Zapruder $150,000, and they just sat on it for about 40 years. I don't know, 35, 40 years. But there were always these bootleg copies like floating around. And you could see, if somebody had, I got the Zapruder film, it was like one of these kind of like, post-hippie kind of like eyes bulging out of your head, kind of too stoned thing to say, but most of these copies of the Zapruder film there were so many dupes of them, they were really almost impossible to see what was happening. But if you watched the Zapruder film enough times and you ran it backwards and forwards, you would see the driver turn around like this, and he looks like he has a gun in his hand. And in fact, if you really look at it long enough, you'll see that actually the so-called gun is actually a reflection off the hair, the Brill-creamed hair of the guy who's sitting next to him. But
when you're attributing, these are Cooper's thoughts, or these are your thoughts?
These are Cooper's thoughts. Okay. No, he's the one that's telling everybody that this is he's selling his copies of the Zapruder film for $35 a piece, and he's giving these lectures in the downstairs in the and the VFW halls. So I knew about this, and I thought it was kind of interesting. And then like flash forward to I don't know, maybe 1993 or something like that, and at the time I was walking down the street in Park Slope where I live, which was not Park Slope as it is now, and I see Old Dirty Bastard, of the Wu-Tang Clan, and he's sitting there on his steps reading Behold the Pale Horse. This book. So, I happen to know, and then I see that the Wu-Tang and several other rappers, including Busta Rhymes and, Tupac and Nas and all these guys, were mentioning this guy, William Cooper, in their raps in the middle 1990s. And I'm thinking, like, I happen at this point, I know here's this big fat kind of guy sitting on top of a hillside in Arizona who has got all these kind of crazy theories, and why are these guys reading this book? So this became a journalistic calling for me to find out why this was. So that's your answer in a long form.
With the Kennedy assassination, my memory is originally it was kind of a left-wing cause, thinking the CIA was involved, that it had to do the Oliver Stone theory, that it was had to do with Vietnam and different things like that. And somehow, over time, it became a right-wing cause. What happened? Well,
I think that it actually was a big question for me, like how conspiracy went from being a left-wing idea to a right-wing idea. And I figured the only person I knew that would really be able to tell me the answer to this was Paul Krasner, so I called him up on a telephone. I assume people know who he is. He used to publish a magazine called The Realist, and we worshipped at his, in the early 60s, you worshipped at Paul Krasner's feet because he was the hippest guy around. And Krasner's still living, still with us, more or less. And so I called him up and I said, well, Paul, how do you think conspiracy and all the Kennedy stuff went from being this left-wing thing to the right-wing thing? And he told me that was the Marshall Tucker Band that did it. And I said, what? He said, because once the right-wing guys started smoking pot, they began to get more as paranoid as the left-wing guys, and then they began to think that the world was kind of because as time changed and the culture began to change, the right-wing people began to feel, the ultimate outcome of this was the election of Donald Trump. Those people that were paranoid enough to think that Donald Trump is going to save them from the Illuminati as represented by Hillary Clinton, which is a reasonable point of view, I think, actually. But in any event, it was like these people began to become more and more convinced. I mean, the Vietnam War was a huge factor in it because, as the thing with Bill Cooper, really one of the major and one of the most poignant to me factors in the life of somebody like Bill Cooper, who grew up in a military family and couldn't wait to get to Vietnam so he could fight for his country, which he felt it was synonymous with freedom. This was freedom, like America was right, whoever they were fighting was wrong, and the reason why they were right is because we were the land of freedom. So Bill Cooper goes over there, and he's the pilot of a PT boat, just like in Apocalypse Now, right? And he's noticing that actually we're not the good guys. It's becoming apparent to him that all that stuff he used to believe is probably full of, it's just not true. We're the bad guys. The other guys, those guys that are, those little guys running around there are just fighting for their homeland and, whatever all the left-wing guys used to think. And at that point, he begins, and it's not just he that begins to believe this, but a lot of the guys that went over there, they begin to feel like, and this is a dramatic event. You're there, these guys are shooting at you, and you're there supposedly to bring freedom to they hate you and they're trying to kill you. So, while the rest of us smarties, walking around, we're like protesting and this kind of stuff. And, I was doing it too. But I mean, the thing is that, like, as the years went by, I began to get more and more sympathy for the people that were stuck in this kind of like unbelievable morass of their feeling of belief about the way the world was, which was proven to them to be completely not true.
And then how does that lead to supporting right-wing political agenda?
Well, I think that these guys, like a guy like Cooper, I mean, one of the questions I always get is like, what would you think of Donald Trump, I would probably hate the guy because, he's not an ideologue, he's an ideologue, because he's a guy, a lot of these people believed in the Constitution and that kind of stuff. And, once the internet comes along, it becomes very different.
Well, you spent a lot of time with one of his main disciples, or kind of the keeper of his archives or something.
Doyle, yes.
So talk about him.
Well, Doyle is actually running for Congress now. He's like running for the, if he wins this election, he will be the state senator with the largest single territory in the United States.
Geographical. Yeah.
Geographical. And, he was a guy who fought in the Iraq War and Desert Storm. Exactly the same story.
Right.
It's the same story. He goes over there because, he told me his life story, like he was a cello prodigy. He's growing up. His family is all pickers from Portersville, California. They were like the Okies. I mean, it was like talking to Tom Joad, right? So, next, a couple more generations removed. And he could have gone, he said, well, I had a full ride to the University of California. It would have taken me, Stanford, because I was such a good cello player. But I wanted to fight for my country. So he went over to Iraq and it didn't take him long to figure out that this was not exactly what was happening. So he tells this great story about how they're moving, they're going to get Saddam. This is the bad guy. They've been told is a bad guy. And then right before they're under the impression that they're going to get Saddam. He's in this last bunker, which is in Basra. And then all of a sudden the war is called off. And he and all the soldiers are standing around there looking around, trying to figure out, like, well, what happened now? And then they look at each other and says, we're going to be back here. We're going to be back here. And he became a disciple of Bill Cooper because there were two men of the West, which is a completely different place than the East in a lot of ways, who felt that they wanted to fight for their country because it was the shining example of all that was right in the world. And then they go there and they're in war where they could easily have been killed, and several of their friends were, and they're beginning to feel like, well, this is not making any sense. And I found it to be very compelling.
So what does he think of Trump? He's still alive, right? He must
Doyle?
know. Yeah.
Well, he's running on the Republican ticket. So we went over there and somebody had put these Trump posters up on his fence. But one day they blew down, and he left them on the ground. So, it just, He's a smart guy. I mean, I don't agree with him about anything, but I like him a lot.
Now,
Taught me how to shoot. My wife too. You know.
So just back up. How does this conspiracy narrative enter the hip hop world? Because we think of this world as being a white, quasi-racist subculture, and yet it became a phenomenon in the black culture.
Well,
how does that happen?
The thing that was really one of the things that made me want to write this book was I found out that this book. This is the most stolen book in the history of Barnes and Nobles. The most shoplifted book, you know, and that you can, even to this day, you cannot buy it off the shelf. You have to ask the guy at the counter, and he'll give it to you. And also, Behold a Pale Horse. I don't know if it doesn't look to me like anybody in this room here knows anybody who's been in the joint recently, but anybody that know somebody. This was this was one of the 4 or 5 most read books in the prison system, especially in New York State prison system, which is one of the worst in the country. I mean, in Attica, they're all reading it. It came out of so that was another one of these questions, like, why are these people reading this book in prison? And if you read the book, you can see that William Cooper was ahead of the curve on paranoia. I mean, he's probably one of the most paranoid guys you could run across, but you know, he's always thinking that people are following him and blah, 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 and stuff like that. And he has and it's more than that, it's a kind of paranoid world view that, like, I'll get into this later, but he has this nature that he has this idea that every day you get up in the morning, it's another day where good is going to battle with evil. And evil is something that's all around you. And I don't know how many people really think about that, but, you know, it's easy to fall into this kind of thing, because I know I certainly did. And, you know, what is the evil part of this particular, who in this room is really the devil, you know, stuff like that. And so it seemed to me that the people, like, it would be hard to find a person, now, of course, I don't know, but I mean, for truth. But I mean, the thing is that I would say that a black prisoner serving a long term in a state prison would be a particularly paranoid kind of person. And this book began to, like, it spoke to them. You know, it was a lot of stuff, and everybody read it. And still to this day, the Nation of Islam, the part that Louis Farrakhan controls, buys 20,000 copies of this book every year. You know, they just give them out because this is the playbook of what you got to know. You got to know, because the society is against you. Everything about, you know, all this stuff. And the fact that William Cooper was a white guy and he was also in naval intelligence makes it all the more convincing.
Now, let me just enter into the conversation here. The Protocols of the Elder of Zion are widely excerpted in Cooper's book. Is that not true?
It's not widely excerpted. He published the whole thing. Well, this is a question that I assume I have to answer, because, you know, if you write a book about a guy who publishes the entire Protocols of the Elders of Zion in his book, you have to kind of, like, address this. So, but I must use a caveat, which was told to me by somebody who was a mutual friend of ours, Mr. Jack Newfield, who said, if the topic of Israel or the Jewish people come up, that's a good time to go out and have a smoke or go to the bathroom, because when the conversation's over, you're going to lose a friend no matter what you say. You know, whatever side you're on, people are going to be mad at you. So with that caveat, I will say, I mean, William Cooper, I mean, that's just the kind of insanity of William Cooper, which is kind of the brilliance of William Cooper. Like, okay, so he publishes the whole thing. Now, why does he publish the whole thing? Because these kind of people who are interested in this kind of way of doing their research, and William Cooper's most famous comment is, read everything, talk to everyone, believe nothing until you can prove it with your own research, which is a very deep comment. I'll get back to it in a minute. But so he said here, the Protocols of the Wise Men of Zion, right? Now, does everybody know what I'm talking about here? Okay, so, like, this is the most infamous document of racist and slander, scapegoating of a particular group of people that is probably the most famous one around, right?
Certainly the most famous anti-Semitic one.
I suppose so. Like now, it's more or less been proven to some extent that this was actually there's no doubt that it's a forgery, but it was probably a forgery of the Tsarist police when they began to get nervous about the Bolsheviks, who they assume are all Jewish. So they wrote this thing, and what it is here is, if I'm William Cooper speaking, defending myself here, I would say that the reason why I published this whole thing here is because this is the most famous and the most successful and the best. It's a perfect document of, if you want to make people seem like they're up to something, this is what you want to read. So, because it's just a masterpiece of this particular, rather repellent kind of like material. So, and the thing that Cooper is well famous for is the author's note. There's no other commentary. I mean, this whole book is full of commentary. And when you look at William Cooper's books, if it's in capital letters, that means he really means it. If it's in italics, he means it, but not as much as the capital letters. And if it's in bold letters, that's also important. You got to pay. That's him. So, because it's basically, this whole book is just a bunch of collection of documents proving that the world is being run by people that that don't like you. So here it says, author's note. This is the exact reprint of the original text. It has been written intentionally to deceive people. For a clear understanding, the word Zion should be transposed. He means transposed to mean Zion. In other words, Z-I-O-N should be always, every time you see the word Zion in here, you should read Sion, which is S-I-O-N, which comes from the priority of Zion, which is some deep Freemasonry kind of like skullduggery. And a reference to the Jews in quotation marks, should be replaced by the word, quotation marks, Illuminati. And the word Goyim should be replaced with the word cattle. Now, this is the only thing he says, and then he goes all the way through the whole thing, just reprinting all of it, So, so most people, I have to say, I got an interview by the guy from the Daily Beast, and he was like really hot on this. Like, how could you write a book about such a bad anti-Semite? So I didn't really handle the question very well, I don't think. Because what I really wanted to say was, because he said, do you think William Cooper is an anti-Semite? And I said, well, yeah, I mean, probably, but no more than anybody else. So, I mean, because my opinion basically is that if you scratch somebody, I mean, I grew up in New York, so, we don't have the same experience of this as a lot of people do. But, if you scratch somebody, it comes out and you can sort of see it, But, so he, so Cooper's, what I wanted to say was the fact that he published this, an anti-Semitic document, possibly anti-Semitic document, didn't necessarily make him an anti-Semite. That's what I wish I said, but I didn't say that. So, but that's the way I feel about it. So, and I think he's probably an anti-Semite, but it doesn't matter if he is or not. So,
more anti-Illuminati, though.
He's more. It's in other words, I think he's defending this on the First Amendment rights.
Who are the Illuminati?
Well, I don't know. I mean,
according to William Cooper.
Well, I mean,
who are they?
Well, I mean, here, for instance, this book, which was published only once in 1991. It was never republished. So here's the Illuminati. This is a fold-out thing where you can read everybody who was a member of the Illuminati. And right at the top, it says David Rockefeller, former... Well, the Trilateral Commission, the CFR, the usual suspects, right? Actually, yeah, well, a lot of them. I mean, it's like my friend Henry, who's here now, once told me, he said, gee, I'm really nostalgic from the time that the CFR used to run everything. You can, everybody's, they're all here. George Bush, Brent Scowcroft, there's lists of media members.
Skull and Bones.
Yeah, Skull and Bones, energy companies. I mean, like the Federal Reserve System, the U.S. military, all the college professors, and that college people. I mean, I don't think this is his list. He just put it in there. So the Illuminati is basically the secret, the hidden force. See, the thing I like about William Cooper is not like Alex Jones. William Cooper is not. You could never write a book about Alex Jones because the guy's a fuck, So, but this guy is like, he precedes him, and he's really attempting to fight for the American ideal, and he's serious about it. He actually stands for this stuff. I mean, I respect the man completely.
Was Alex Jones around? Did they know of each other?
Alex, you know how like when you used to go to bed and your parents would tell you to go to sleep, and like you were listening to Murray Decay or Cousin Brucey underneath the covers,
I like Gene Shepard.
Yeah, Gene Shepard. Well, Gene Shepard, actually, William Cooper is very reminiscent of Gene Shepard in his cadences. He's a brilliant radio guy. I mean, he could kind of, if he wasn't saying these things that you go like, what? He can convince you of almost anything. And he convinced me of several things, I got to tell you. So what Alex Jones was doing is he was under the covers when his mom was telling him about listening to William Cooper and learning and picking up on it. He went to school on William Cooper. And in fact, the night that William Cooper was killed, Alex Jones did the only meaningful reporting on it by calling up William Cooper's neighbors to find out what really happened. And this guy who I talked to, that's in the book, this guy Glenn Jacobs, who had fallen out with William Cooper. And so Alex Jones calls him up and says, so the feds killed him, right? The feds killed him. And Jacobs, who lives like about 40 yards from where William Cooper was shot, he said, no, it was the Apache County sheriffs. It was not the feds. He said, the feds killed him, right? And he said, no, it wasn't the feds. And he said, at that point, he began to realize that Alex Jones was not going to be like William Cooper.
But did Cooper know of Jones? Was Jones?
Yeah, he was on his show.
He was on it.
He was on a show, and Alex Jones was always incredibly respectful of William Cooper, who was like his godfather in this thing. But Alex Jones has since gone. Most William Cooper fans will tell you that Alex Jones is a usurper and miserable fellow,
You wanted me to ask this question.
Oh, I did.
You said you wanted to write an intellectual biography about someone who is fundamentally anti-intellectual. How does that work?
Oh, how does that work? I mean, the thing is that, like, I think that we're here in the rare book room. We're in a citadel of the Enlightenment, basically. And there are these people that don't necessarily go along with this. I mean, they're Christians. They don't believe necessarily, and it isn't like William Cooper, I think, was definitely a believer in evolution. I mean, from everything I can tell. I mean, he was pretty rational about most things. And but when you believe that good and evil is a battle and every day is a struggle, then you can't be necessarily in the intellectual world. But he's an intellectual in the sense that, for instance, one of the things that he did, which I always thought was great, I mean, just a stroke of genius, of postmodern genius, was that he had this idea that that you had to go back to the beginning, because just like you have to reprint the entire thing of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, you can't have any ideas about history unless you go back to the beginning of history. You can't just go on the show on Fox News and say blah blah blah, some kind of soundbite that you just heard about 5 minutes ago. You have to do your research, and you've got to go back all the way to the beginning to find out where this all comes from. So William Cooper was obsessed to go back to the beginning of cosmology, and so cosmology for him began in the Genesis book of the Bible, in the Garden of Eden. Now in the Garden of Eden, everybody knows that the beginning of modern consciousness comes when Eve eats the apple and convinces Adam, and the name of the proper name of the tree is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's what and that's what it says in the Bible. And even though it's not usually spoken that way, but the thing is that so Cooper I see you edging up here. So, this will be the last thing I'll say, and then we'll throw it open to questions. But so Cooper wants to go back to the beginning of time, but he can't really. What new can you say about the Garden of Eden? So he finds a new beginning of time and cosmology and consciousness by going back to his favorite movie, 2001: A Space Odyssey. And he looks, when the monolith comes down and the monkey or whatever he is touches the thing, and then all of a sudden he gets smart and violent and all kinds of things that that William Cooper, who believes that the mind of man is basically an evil thing, because the first thing he does is kill somebody, kill another one of his fellow species, and that makes him a human being. So I thought the idea that he would kind of substitute the monolith in Stanley Kubrick's movie for the tree of good and evil in the Bible was just sort of struck me as a kind of brilliant idea, So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I got to say.
Didn't he think that the whole movie was some sort of code for something else?
Yeah, of course. Everything's a code for something else. I mean, there's all these symbology. He's the only person I know that ever used the word symbology. I mean, most people use the word symbolism, but he uses the word symbology. So, and everything there was a code that Kubrick was, a 33rd degree, whatever he was, and he was making this movie as a textbook, so all the master masons out there would understand what was going on. And if you knew how to look at it, you'd see one movie, or if you were just some stone hippie like myself sitting in the first row going, watching this thing, you'd think another thing. So, but that's kind of the way people's minds work. That's enough of my blather. I mean, does anybody have a question? Yes.
So I don't know if this. No, there is a partial validation of one of Cooper's ideas about the JFK assassination.
The car thing? Oh, go ahead.
Not the car thing. that of all the enemies JFK had amassed, and there were numerous.
Of course.
Any one of them was capable of carrying out the assassination.
Yes.
The one thing that really only surfaced about a year ago was that Kennedy found out there were some documents released. There was a Kennedy archive where a lot of documents were released, and one of the obscure ones said he discovered about the U.S. Navy's secret space program.
Really? That's true. That's a William Cooper thing.
And the Navy has been running a space program longer than the Air Force. That's a whole nother side story. But the point is, Kennedy discovered this. He realized how much money and energy would have to go into the accomplishment of the Navy's mission of deep space. And he thought, I've just built this relationship with Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I have a hotline. He and I both know we can't trust our generals. Why don't I talk to him, and we'll join forces? And we'll combine a U.S.-Soviet space command.
I like the driver much better than that. But
and he actually went to the Joint Chiefs. This is in the document, by the way. He went to the Joint Chiefs and said, what do you think of that idea?
And that was it, huh?
And they said, well, there's another reason you're going to go by the wayside, buddy.
Okay, I'll put that on the list. but I mean, I got to say, one of the reasons that Cooper, actually Chris Carter, the X-Files guy, stole this completely from Bill Cooper, that the reason why Kennedy was killed was because he was gonna lift the lid on the UFO thing. He was gonna finally tell everybody that UFOs were real, that we had them, we had every single one of these guys in these underground caves and all that kind of stuff. So,
Well, yeah, I don't want to go into that too much, but there are a lot of underground bases around Area 51. But the point is, the thing that Kennedy...
I see you have a live one here.
No. I actually know two naval officers who were part of moving the Montauk Project to Nevada.
No, I mean, Area 51. I mean, did you ever go drinking at the Little Alley Inn?
Yeah.
It's fun.
But no, the thing about the aliens is that the document did not talk about aliens. It just talked about a space.
Of course, it didn't talk about aliens because it's too top secret.
No. But the space program
Yeah, no, I understand. That is true that Cooper thought that there were 2 space programs.
Any other questions from the audience?
I want to ask one more question.
Go ahead.
Which is that it's fun to make fun of these things, deservedly so. But I know from reading the book that you love this guy.
I really respect him. I think I find his life to be incredibly poignant. I mean, especially his family stuff, which I really felt to be. I mean, he was a bull in a china shop of a human being, and he just ran through people's lives by obsessively trying to push these theories. It came out later that he was married at least 6 times. Doyle was the one that told me that. I talked with a couple of his ex-wives, all of which, he left him because he was an abusive drunk, and a bunch of other stuff, that, of course, I mentioned this in one of these interviews I gave to Thing, and then I got this unbelievable avalanche of hate mail from the Bill Cooper fans that told me this could not possibly be true. So, but in any event, I hope somebody else has a question. No more questions?
Cooking with Cooper.
Excuse me?
The Cooking with Cooper.
Cooking with Cooper, yes. Well, he used to make these home movies of him and his family and sell them on the internet, and one of them was Cooking with Cooper. It was good.
Where he cooked the turkey when he was still raw and good.
It was a sad moment, really.
Without giving away whatever the ending, what was the story with the sheriffs or the feds and coming and killing him?
Well, I mean, my take on it is that it was one of the most complicated suicide by cop things that ever could possibly been devised, because he really, my confidant in this guy named Doyle Shamley, who Danny referred to, said that Bill had told him, well, at least I could be a martyr. And then he was desperate for the feds to come up there and shoot it out with him, but the feds had already gone through Waco and Ruby Ridge and this kind of stuff, which is detailed in the book, and they didn't want to duke it out with this guy. I mean, for several reasons, because people were going to get killed. And then later, so Cooper was up there, and this is completely debatable about what really happened, but one day the town that he lives in is almost all Mormons. So he decides that he's going to, and he would often, if people came, he lived on top of this hill, and if anybody came on the top of the hill, he would chase them away, even though he didn't own the property. So he was getting crazy, and he was under the delusion that he owned this entire mountain, which is about 200 feet tall. So so the guy named Scott Hamlin, who's a town doctor, who's the current president of the Mormon Stake, which is in Arizona, came up there with his young family. This is we're talking about 17 years ago, and he was just watching the sunset because it's the best view in the whole town. And so Bill Cooper came out and chased him down to his home, just kind of rode in his pickup truck, tailgating him the whole way down there, and said, "If you come on my property again, I'm going to kill you." And he pointed his gun at the guy, and the guy's like, whoa. And the Hamlins were are the best known Mormon family in that whole area. I mean, they're like royalty, Mormon royalty. I mean, I don't know how to say it. I don't want to besmirch their thing, but he's a big shot. So you couldn't have picked a worse guy or a better guy to do this to, and at that point, it was inevitable that somebody had to do something about this madman who lived on the hill. I mean, in fact, the high school students used to go out there and make a lot of noise just to see if they could get Bill Cooper to come out there and chase them away, because this was near the end of his career. He was really losing his mind. Yes? Ratso. You have a question, Ratso.
Yeah, I'm curious. What were his religious beliefs? Was he a Christian? Was he a Gnostic? Was he anti-religion?
Well, he used to say that he believed in one of his great quotes, I thought, was he believed in the words of Jesus Christ as written and read in a Bible found in a drawer in a motel room. I think it was I think he had really he claimed to be a Christian because, I mean, he's trying to make a living on right-wing Christian radio. I mean, you're not going to say you're not a Christian, but I think he was like, he's the thing about him is like he always was trying to make a living. He was half a huckster. That's what made him, he was like half a huckster, half a prophet, 100% American. I mean, to me, and that's really what he was. He was a real kind of, latter day. P.T. Barnum's the wrong comparison, but there was some of that in there, and there's this kind of like that whole feeling of America as the new land where you got another chance, because all the society that was fucked up from Europe, all the things that have gone wrong, and then in America was going to be the New Jerusalem, and everything was going to be okay. Finally, humanity got another chance, and then we fucked it up again. So and people would move to California just because they wanted to get to the promised land. So they got there, and it was like more shopping centers and stuff like that. And then after a while, you began to realize, like, well, maybe this doesn't exist. And I think it was very depressing, for somebody like Bill Cooper. And his religion was based in good portion on that kind of feeling of deflation of his dreams for a better world.
You were talking the other day about the idea of freedom, and what does freedom mean to somebody like that?
Well, I think freedom that's really what that's what he cared about. He cared about freedom, right? The idea of freedom is an elusive idea. I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, if he asked everybody in this room what their definition of the word freedom is, I think you'd probably get a different answer from everybody. But, I mean, that's what he was seeking, and he found that he felt that the only way to find freedom was to defeat the enemies of freedom, which went through first with the aliens from outer space that were like, meant us no good, and then there was the secret societies with the Freemasons who were trying to screw you over, and then there were like all these different groups and the government, of course, and these kind of things that were like going to interfere with the freedom of the individual. The individual, I mean, that's the curse and the glory of America, individual freedom. And this guy wanted it, and he couldn't find it. And he searched for it much harder than most people do. And that's really why, I think that's really the main reason I wanted to write this book. I mean, here's a guy as wacky as he was, and as kind of like declassé as he was. I mean, he was really searching for freedom, and I think you find the roots of what's going on now in that search. I mean, that kind of thing we were talking about the other night. Well, like when we were all hippies, I mean, there was the hip and the straight, and the straight guys were all fucked up, and the hip guys were good, and that same dichotomy of, is what got Donald Trump elected. So, and those kind of things run through the society, and it's going to always run through the society, because I don't see how you fix it. But unless you can figure it out, but there's always going to be that kind of dichotomy of the people that believe a certain kind of way. I mean, the time I remember. George Bush would he would talk about being born again, which was like obviously a bunch of crap, I thought. But I feel like, I didn't realize that he was actually getting votes by saying this, because I'm just so out of it. I'm from Queens. What do I know? It's like, so, I mean, these kind of parts of America that you don't look at and you don't take seriously, that's just part of the country, and if you don't pay attention to those people, you're going to wind up with a situation like we got now, and it's not good. I mean, well, I don't know. I mean, no, it's not good. I mean, it's not good. It's like the thing is that, like, when I went out there and they're talking about land use, and it's so easy to see who's the good guy and the bad guy in the land use situations in a state where the federal government owns over 80% of the land. Well, the federal government owns 3% of the land, or 4% of the land east of the Mississippi River. On the west of the Mississippi River, they own over 40%, and some states they own upwards of 75%. So if you're bitching about the government, I'm not talking about these lunatics like the Bundys, but I mean, the Bundys got off because they were tried by a jury of their peers who agreed with them. you know. And then back here we're going like, oh God, those motherfuckers got off, you know. I mean, but how could they not get off, you know? I mean, that's the way it goes. Hi, Jim.
We've got one time for this. This is the last question of the night.
Okay.
It's not really a question. I'm just curious your comment on this, because one thing that was very prominent in Trump's election that Cooper addressed a lot was the whole idea of globalism. Right. Yeah. And what I found, I grew up listening to, not grew up listening to Cooper, but I listened to his shortwave radio.
Jim made a very good documentary about Bill Cooper, and he's the first guy that I actually talked to when I was beginning this book.
You can find the film on Amazon anyway. But anyway.
On Amazon.
Shameless pitch. But anyway, I'm sorry? The Hour of Our Time, The Legacy of William Cooper. But that was
it's the best reference about Bill Cooper, and really, I mean, don't read the stuff on the internet because it's really wacko.
Yeah, it's all told in Doyle's words and the people who knew him. But anyway, back to the question. So globalism was a big thing that he was always railing against, and I found it very interesting because, you know, I grew up around here. I grew up listening to WBAI, and then at night I listened to Bill Cooper, right? So there was this dichotomy. But then you find out, like a couple decades later, there is a synergy, right? Because the left tend to call it globalism, the right tended to call it the New World Order.
Yeah.
And there was a certain point where it all sort of converged, and they were kind of talking about the same thing. So what are your thoughts on that? Because I think that was a big thing for Trump.
No, I agree with you completely. I mean, the thing is that the idea of the global economy, as we see, you know, 10 years ago, you might have said, well, it would be pretty interesting to see what's going to happen. Now you see that Jeff Bezos is the capital of the world, is the most important guy in the whole world. So it's not Donald Trump, you know, so like, and that is totally globalized. That's a completely globalization, dehumanization of society that, you know, but the Amazon guy sends it in one day, you know, so it's like hard to resist. Like Amazon crime's like crack. You know, it's like crack. You know, you can't get yourself off it. So, like, you know, I agree with you. It's a big problem, and it's a big problem intellectually for people that are thinking about the way the world is, and you just have to kind of come to terms with it. And some of the Trump stuff, not the stuff that he actually says, but some of that kind of stuff is legitimate. You know, and I find it to be so demoralizing that the way what Trump did to me in a way made me stop reading the New York Times, because I don't want to read that stuff. I hate propaganda. Well, I mean, if you start reading a Paul Krugman column and it's like starts off, well, Donald Trump's a real moron. You're like, okay, next. You know, it's like, you know, I mean, you know, and then like honestly, a weird thing happened the other day when they had that anonymous thing which is in the paper. So this is like the left-wing version of. Does anybody out here know what QAnon is? So QAnon is this guy that supposedly works for Trump and is like going to tell you the inside stuff about Donald Trump for the right-wing guys. And now this guy, whoever this person is, this man or woman, you know, I'm going for Jared Kushner myself, but you know, this is the same thing. It's like anonymous. So, you know, I feel like the conspiracy thinking, it's not something that you can like or not like, because it's so endemic to the society that you can't get rid of it. Because nobody, the whole nature of society is up for grabs at the moment. So in a situation like that, when there's nothing really to believe in, you know, when that's when thought processes are up for grabs, and you get these kind of stories, some of which are a lot better than the official story. You know, they just are. You know, so. Yeah, well, it's more titillating. It might actually be closer to the truth. Who knows? So, but, you know, in any event, it was a lot of fun working on this book, except when it was driving me insane. And I'm glad you all came, and I thank Danny for being here. And I'd be happy to sign anybody's book.